Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Dylan Kisane, and I'm a member of the marketing team here at Inova Software. First of all, thank you for taking the time to attend our webinar today. I know for many of you it is a difficult time right now, and I hope that you and your families are making it through this pandemic period very safely. Today's webinar is another in our regular series of webinars that gather the biopharma community together to exchange and share best practices. To give you an idea of who's joining us on the call today, we have a little more than 270 people registered coming from all kinds of life science companies, from small biotechs to top 50 pharma companies, research institutes, and government departments as well. And now on to today's webinar topic, the art and science of biopharma due diligence, lessons from Eli Lilly. Our guests on today's webinar are two due diligence experts from Lilly, Mike Myers, Senior Director, Global External R&D and Due Diligence at Lilly, and Scott Simmons, a consultant in due diligence at Lilly. They'll be joined by our own Shankar Shrestha, a Senior Solutions Consultant at Inova. Now, before we dive in, just a few administrative logistics. Your microphones will be on mute during the presentation so we can minimize the background noise. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the chat window and we're going to work through those as we can. After the presentations, we'll be opening things up for some further discussions and Q&A. We're going to record this webinar, so if you had colleagues that couldn't attend today, or if you'd like to watch it again later to refresh your memory, we'll be sending you a link to the recording tomorrow. And also at the end of the webinar, you'll see a pop-up survey to complete. And this helps us to make sure that we're providing you with the content that you need. And it's also a chance to let us know if you would like to participate along with us as a future webinar panelist. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Mike and to Scott to get things started. Gentlemen, over to you.
Well, thank you. Good morning and good afternoon. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully you all can see slides. First of all, I want to thank colleagues at Inova for this invitation to join the webinar series and provide a bit of an overview of how we think about due diligence at Lilly, give you some philosophical and practical perspectives. Scott and I have been working together as part of our external innovation team at Lilly for some time. I think collectively, between Scott and I, we've been working in pharma for over 50 years. We're certainly going to be available for questions at the end. We're going to rip through a number of things, and here's the agenda. And we're going to cover a little bit of the background on sourcing innovation and some knowledge management philosophy. Talk a little bit basics about bias and how it might be addressed in diligence. And then I'll turn it over to Scott, who's going to talk about how you might go about building the story in your own approach to diligence. And then we'll come back to some tactics and what deal professionals can do to navigate bias. So with that, I'm going to take you through just a little bit of background. If you look at the drugs that have been approved by the FDA, or frankly anywhere on the planet in the last 10 years, what you will find is that things have changed somewhat, in that most of the innovation being carried across the finish line isn't invented by the sponsors that are running those traps with regulatory authorities. In fact, a lot of the innovation is coming from small biotechs, medium-sized pharma, research institutes, universities, et cetera. And frankly, there's a whole lot of intellectual property that has to come together to deliver an opportunity over the finish line. So that's not the case 20, 25 years ago. Most companies had the inventors, they conducted the development and carried it over the finish line themselves. The world's quite different today, and so you need to be prepared to identify innovation from the outside, as well as when it comes time to make trade-offs to put your innovation in other people's hands that in fact might be able to take it to patients. for other indications, for example, or in case there's some additional risk that needs to be discharged, you can put that in somebody else's hands. Scott and I work with a team of professionals at Lilly, and we not only lead due diligence on inbound opportunities in licensing and acquisition, but our team also supports diligence and partnering on Lilly assets. So we've been on both sides of the equation and appreciate any questions you all might have. The next slide I have is a slide on philosophy. In fact, when you think about anything you're doing in your day job, it's important to think about issues that you're seeing or processes that you're deploying and apply a good knowledge management strategy. When it comes to diligence, it's a process we run quite often, requires some flexibility, but ultimately you cannot do a good job on diligence without having the right subject matter experts. These are the kind of folks who've spent nothing but their entire life on neuroscience or mechanisms of action or indications that they've been focused on and engaged in. And so there's no really good replacement for not having the right subject matter experts. Now, these folks aren't always participating on global cross-functional teams. And so ultimately, you need to supplement that group with people that are cross-functionally fluid. So pharmaceutical project managers, colleagues that work on global teams, they know and can discuss all those issues that happen on the interfaces between our functions. Now, those folks aren't necessarily governance members for internal governance. They may not be functional area leaders. Generally, those folks just have that much more collective experience. They know how the organization has dealt with risks and issues and opportunities in the past. They're the ones that can assign the resources that might be required to remediate any identified issues. And ultimately, we're all beholden to downstream customers. And obviously, there's the patient, but there are payers and there are providers. And in your own organization, there are always downstream customers. So you take all those people that are required for the complex, I would say, job of drug hunting. You put those people together without a process and you have pandemonium. So ultimately, you need a process. So think about the steps involved in certain parts of your business. And development, of course, we have SOPs. And SOPs are steps that people must follow. Otherwise, you could be in trouble with the government, or in fact, you could be, putting patients at risk. And that's obviously not acceptable. So in development, we have SOPs. In research and early drug discovery, there are no SOPs. In fact, you're coached quite heavily to think outside the box. The way I think about processes is it's all about knowledge sharing. People encode steps in a process because that's the logical, let's say, cheapest way to go about de-risking something. It also keeps you out of trouble with the government. And if you're using a process like a checklist, it's probably not going to end well for you someday. So do everything you can to really understand how those steps are organized, what's behind the steps, why, in fact, that they're put in the position they are. Ultimately, to do our day job in the world of drug discovery and drug development, people have an amazing array of access to proprietary databases, shared drives, websites, team documents, minutes, not just Google, but some places where you go to, in fact, find information quickly. And ultimately, if you have subject matter experts that are not fluent in getting access to data, you have a problem. Ultimately, it's best that when people find something, some data, some important article and document, that you have the right subject matter experts interpreting that data and applying it to the context of the opportunity you're looking at. So this is what's important about a process. And I would ask you to think about in your own area where you're having issues or trouble or constantly being blindsided. Think through the lens of knowledge management and see if, in fact, you have world-class subject matter experts, but, for example, they haven't been onboarded properly to your organization. Okay, little ditty on bias. What your brain doing right now is telling you that the spot on your left is lighter than the spot on the right. And of course, your brain is using the context of the shading around those spots to help you discriminate. You know it's a visual illusion, so you're guessing that those two spots are the same color, that your brain won't get there, okay? Now, the analogy I'd say that this applies to is when you are listening to somebody speak, like myself, two very reasonable people might in fact hear very different things depending on the complexity of the discussion and depending on what's going on in their head, their collective set of experiences, how they're interpreting the inflection of my voice to perhaps argue that maybe what I'm saying isn't honest, or it is honest, okay? So two very reasonable people can hear the same thing and come to somewhat orthogonal conclusions. It's exactly the same thing when two people are reading minutes from an FDA meeting. So it's really important that you acknowledge our brain is constantly working for us to help discriminate, but sometimes we need to check our biases at the door. If I were to cut a perfect square, same size out of each of these circles and put them together on a white background, this is what that looks like. So clearly with the context of the white background, these two individual squares are the same. So what provides any kind of mitigation for bias and prevents a train wreck when it comes to running diligence? Ultimately, you need to think about the challenges around framing the opportunity. Is your organization or sponsor kind of part of the business too hungry? They have such a big gap that they need to fill that they'll just take anything? Or, in fact, are you seeing behaviors that are too conservative, that people won't go out on the risk curve to look at something? These deals are quite competitive and things are moving quick. And so is deal pressure or deal fever impacting your ability to get to the bottom of the facts? You know, when you hear a sales pitch, that's kind of tapping on your anchoring bias. Here are the three questions that sponsors want you to pursue. It's not going to probably end well if that's all that you look at. You need to look at the blind spots. So what's your blind spot bias? Sometimes people are really nervous. They know their boss or organization is committing a lot of resources, and they're really worried about activities and answers they don't have to questions that maybe are important for day one when the deal has been signed and closed. But really, do you need that level of detail in the first days of diligence? Are you really still working to inform the overall deal decision? Ultimately, there's mitigation to these biases. Partners and their collective experiences, as well as their consultants and outside vendors, provide some mitigation for missing anything. Their governance, venture capital owners, investors, and board are all very committed to understanding how their money's being spent, when the risks are being discharged, is everybody doing everything right? And we're all dealing with the same regulatory and government agencies, which provide another layer of mitigation. Ultimately, internal to your own company, you have a pre-diligence process and sanction review. So, having a good deep look at something to really ensure that you're interested before you sanction all the resources required for diligence is important. When we go to diligence and have a look at a phase 2 or phase 3 asset, that can be 25 to 30 world-class experts across the entire value chain. That's like between 300 and 500 years of drug development, drug discovery experience that you're deploying to review a data package. Ultimately, those folks have to come back and perhaps network their findings, do a review with the sponsor. You've got internal governance, an executive committee, and board, depending on the nature of the deal. On the right-hand side is a cartoon that Scott's going to take you through kind of give you some perspective as the direction we provide to our diligence team members. There's some education you can do yourself to study bias, study how to best inform decisions. A couple of those books are here. You'll have this available. I'd encourage you, if you're in this business, whether it's on the pre-diligence side or diligence or deal-making side, I assure you this will be very helpful for you to think about. I'm going to turn it over now to Scott. He's going to talk a little bit about how we go about building the story.
Thank you, Mike. Can you hear me?
Yep, all good.
Okay, well, thank you to everyone joining the call. Really appreciate your time, and thank you very much again for having Mike and I along for the ride. If you want to move on to the next slide, Mike, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on what Lilly's process looks like and how it might be different from sort of standard or popular approaches. The backdrop of this particular slide is the result of a Google search, a Google image search for due diligence checklist. That's one popular way of getting your questions and answers out there in due diligence. Mike and I, our teams like to dive a little bit deeper, and so what we like to do is use functional area themes, not only to drive the knowledge acquisition piece of due diligence, but also at that bottom bullet to build a coherent and synthetic story for our project sponsors. And so we use themes to, in many ways build a narrative and chapters of a narrative to fully characterize an investment opportunity. And so Mike had shown you this graphic before of knowledge management, and that's kind of the guiding principle that we use in characterizing an investment opportunity. Mike, do you want to move on to the next slide? And so where to begin in informing your own perspective? And so again, Mike had this graphic up on one of his slides, but let me talk about that a little bit more. And so often what we get from a partner in a presentation or something like that at the beginning of due diligence really shows their perspective. Sometimes that's rosy, but the partner's obviously gone through a series of hypotheses and experiments, made data and observations, analyzed and interpreted that data, and then drew conclusions and predictions, which they then present to you as their perspective. If we were just going to trust and believe that, then of course we wouldn't need to do diligence. What we want to do is to, as much as possible, remove the black box from this, have our teams run through as much as possible this series of events from hypotheses and experiments all the way down through data analysis conclusions and form our own perspective. It might be fairly close. It might have some pretty extreme departure from what the partner's perspective is. But again, going back to Mike's remarks on bias, we want to make sure to, as much as possible, remove any bias that's coming from the partner's perspective so that we can form our own and see how those come back and match up at the end. So Mike's built this slide while I was talking over on the right. Common question that we get from sponsors is exactly this. Do we agree with the partner's perspective, and why or why not? So getting under this black box is an important technique for answering this question for sponsors. Other things that we're going to want to do in due diligence are to, from our side, assign the best scientific minds we have to think through this chain of events. It's also important to remember what kind of agent we're looking at. And so these comes in all shapes and sizes, small molecules, large molecules, peptides, somewhere in between small and large, devices, technologies. Maybe we're looking at capabilities, which is another thing, deal permutation that we might have. Important not to forget implementation. So while the focus of due diligence is often on the scientific and technical information, it's important to understand how this is going to play out if a deal is done. If Lilly is going to do development, we want to be prepared for with an implementation plan for that. If the plan is for a partner to continue to develop, we want to fully understand their implementation plan as well. And so in that light, we not only assign scientists to our due diligence teams, but assign project managers to capture scientific inputs and the implications of those and really build those into a project plan and a business case. And finally on this slide, and Mike alluded to this, we include networking in our process. So we see it as critical that our functional area experts' perspectives get appropriately vetted with their leadership prior to forming a recommendation. So it's one thing to have a scientist on the due diligence team forming a perspective, but if you have them network their findings within their functional area, you come out with a more powerful and aligned message that can, then give additional impact to your recommendation. Let's move on to the next slide, Mike. So I alluded to themes at the outset, and that's really what's driving my part of this conversation. And I want to give you a sense, and this is just one example, this one from clinical statistics, of how we use themes not only to drive the knowledge acquisition piece, as I said, but to help us form a narrative around this particular opportunity. Now, again, this is only one functional area, and we might have 15 or 20 functional areas all participating with their associated set of themes and sub-themes. And I realize this is an eye chart, so it may be hard to follow all of it, but the themes in the center are the key for us. The sub-themes are there to as guidance for our functional area experts to appropriately report around these themes. Again, you'll see that most of these are scientific and technical. And, if you know clinical statistics, these probably make a lot of sense, right? So are the partner study designs appropriate? Have they implemented studies appropriately? What's their efficacy data look like? What's their safety data look like? What are their clinical plans and study designs for upcoming studies look like? And what's the regulatory environment that we're playing in? All pretty straightforward, but you can see that the last one on here is more about implementation. So what are the credentials and competency of the statistical staff? If we're looking at an opportunity where a partner might be implementing a plan, we also might be looking at something like capabilities. And so whether they have the expertise in-house to be able to do what we're asking and what we're signing up for. So this just gives you a sense, again, one of 15 or 20 functional areas that all have themes driving the acquisition of their knowledge around data disclosures, whether those are site visits or data rooms, et cetera. And Mike, go ahead and move to the next slide, and I'll show you a little bit more about how we put this into practice. So we do ask our functional area experts to anchor around a standard. And that standard depends on what kind of a development opportunity we're looking at. So let's say we're looking at something that's advertised by the partner as phase 2 ready. Our scientists have a good grounding in what Lilly's internal standard is for a phase 2 ready asset. And so we ask them for each theme to make a call one way or the other. Does this meet Lilly's internal standard for a phase 2 ready asset? Are there gaps to what the partner has completed to that internal standard for phase 2 ready, right? And those can be moderate or significant. On the other hand, the partner might have done more work than we would typically do for a phase 2 ready asset, in which case we would rate that theme as a strength, again, either significant or moderate. And I've given you some examples out on the right-hand side of ratings that we might apply. And these are kind of across the board. So some neutrals, some significant gaps. These are all very informative, right? And can really help sponsors understand not only the overall perspective on the opportunity, but to the granular level for each of these themes. Are there gaps in the program? Are there strengths in the program? Is our opinion on this particular functional area that this asset is indeed phase 2 ready or not, right? Mike, if you'll move on to the next slide, I'll talk through this second step, and that second quantification, which is just because something is a strength to our standard doesn't necessarily mean that it's a high benefit. Just because something's a gap to our standard doesn't necessarily mean it's a high risk. And so we asked team members to double click on these themes to, if you've called it a strength, tell me how much of a benefit that strength is. If you've identified a gap, let's understand what the risk is around that gap. And so again, I've provided some examples out here on the right of ways that those might be characterized. You can probably foretell how we use something like this, because if something, consistently comes across as a significant high-risk gap, that's something that we're going to, take pains to articulate to our sponsor so that they very clearly understand what those are. Again, not necessarily all gaps carry high risk with them, and so articulating exactly which ones do can really help frame where the development risks are within an opportunity. And putting both of these pieces together, the theme rating and the relative benefit and risk associated with that theme rating, can give us a much better overall sense of, in the example I used, is this really a phase 2 ready asset, or is there more work yet to be done to bring it up to phase 2 readiness? So some maybe remediation that needs to happen in those plans. Mike, if you'll go on to the next slide. Let me talk a little bit about building the aligned recommendation. So like I said, we want to use themes to not only drive knowledge acquisition, which I've talked about before, but to fully characterize an opportunity. And you can see how that plays out somewhat on the graphic on the left-hand side. So many of the things that I discussed, starting with themes at the bottom, through data and observations, through analysis and interpretation, to identify what strengths and gaps there are, what benefit and risk might be associated with those strengths and gaps, your likelihood of being successful over your resource intensity. And so trying to get a sense of that, again, the sort of implementation mindset built into this, and all coming together at the top of the pyramid on conclusions and recommendations that we would make to a sponsor. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can see, some sort of further thoughts and things that we use in our process. So we always convene our entire DD team for a session to integrate findings, harmonize perspectives. And as I talked about a little earlier, that integration happens after networking. And so you have the benefit of having kind of full functional area alignment with the theme ratings that the functional area experts are bringing in to the integration meeting. Sometimes similar functional areas network their findings up through different parts of the organization. And you want to make sure that those findings are all harmonized and make sense together, right? And so that's something that we're also doing in a data integration meeting is taking in those functional area networked perspectives and making sure that we have alignment across all functional areas on how they're thinking on those particular themes. Another big piece of what our experts are expected to do is to document their perspectives, their opinions, and their theme ratings in their functional area reports. And so the due diligence process that we run brings all of these together for the decision sponsor to really provide a cohesive view across all functional areas. We're also going to want to synthesize a brief summary of the opportunity. As I said, we're going to highlight noteworthy areas within the assessment. And if there are themes with significant high-risk gaps, those will be called out, especially for the sponsor. And lastly, on this slide, we want to make a clear recommendation to sponsors. And as I said, at this point, your recommendation or the team's recommendation carries the full weight of functional area support. Mike, here, I think bring to the end of the sort of detail around themes. Maybe you can take it to the next slide and pick it up from there. Mike, you might be on mute.
My audio connection was blinking, so hopefully
Mike,
I'm back. You can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, very good. Yeah, my internet connection seems to be blinking. Apologies. So I'm going to go to this next slide and get through the next two slides fairly quickly. And as I understand it, the slides will be made available to participants afterwards. Ultimately, you know, there are common versus best practices approaches, and I've listed some here on the left-hand side. I think one thing that we attempt to deploy as completely as possible is having a very thorough pre-diligence process. So really working to fully inform a non-binding offer, getting alignment with our internal leadership and sponsors is in some ways key. It lowers the amount of surprise that might show up in diligence as you get into deeper level of access of the raw data, regulatory minutes exchanges such as that. Well, ultimately, I think there's a common approach that people deploy in terms of just using PowerPoint summaries, or they data dump everything. Ultimately, you know, the best practice is to have access to the raw data behind those key points that are showing up in the PowerPoint slides, along with all the key communications and documents. You don't need all the pedantic exchanges that go back and forth with regulators, application forms, et cetera. That's not all that useful. We assume those kinds of things are being done because the government requires it. In other cases, partner, in fact, might provide a sell presentation multiple times to the organization as you have pre-diligence discussions, perhaps have met face-to-face. Ultimately, there's a larger group now that's interested. We have a sales pitch again. Our search and evaluate experts generally take on the responsibility to review that data, objectively present it, to brief the diligence team to get them going, make sure the diligence team hears and is anchored with the key pressing questions that the sponsors have to confirm their interest. Of course, it's an anchoring exercise, so we work, in fact, to try and make sure that the diligence team understands the full scope of the deal. Ultimately, all the questions and data requests go to the partner for response. You know, a better practice is to prioritize those things that are stage appropriate, things that really go to the deal valuation and firming up your binding offer. Those got to be nailed in the first stages of diligence. All the minor details that are really important for day one kinds of activity, day one being day you've signed the deal, those kinds of details can be held for later. But ultimately, having everyone on the phone for Q&A seems to be, in fact, so folks that are interested in preclinical can sit in on that session. Others that would be interested are also available for that session, and then a separate meeting for clinical regulatory, and then CMC and other breakout sessions. but doing that in a concise fashion that's predictable, not only for your team, but for the partner, can make it much more organized. Those are just some suggestions. Certainly during Q&A, if you have other questions, we'll be happy to take you through some other things. Ultimately, when it comes to discharging bias, you need to think about what processes you have in place to out potential blind spots or points of bias. What kind of process does your organization support in terms of having a very good view of probabilities, have an updated, detailed clinical plan, and enough fine points on the target product profile? How does that map to development plan, resource estimate, your updated forecast, and ultimately, what are the remaining things that you have cataloged for representation or standing in terms of diligence that has yet to be completed? I think there's some other important aspects. Understanding the partners' timeline and their expectations. They certainly usually have a board involved or investors, and so those people have expectations, and it's great to deliver to their expectations, especially when it's competitive. You need to yield to those kinds of requirements. You need to understand what work's still going on, and ultimately, who are all the experts that we being on the buy side or the partnering side, going to need to deliver this opportunity to the next key milestones. So those are some things that we feel are important to provide some layers of mitigation. Ultimately, having a great pre-diligence body of work to inform the sponsor's interest and the business case supports a really good virtual approach to stage one. I think ultimately, whether you're on the buy side or the sell side, you need to be transparent with your partner to make sure they understand your obligations, timelines that your organization and sponsors are setting, and work with their expectations and what their sponsors and governance are expecting as well. Ultimately, if partners' capabilities are to be involved in a plan forward, a face-to-face meeting is always best, clearly. You need to really start to take on board some of the perspectives of that team's culture, how they like to work, how they make decisions, how they best work through difficult decisions. So that is, frankly, our view of the best approach when it comes to assessing capabilities. I just want to pause and thank the Inova team again for their years of partnership and helping us with the tools that they've provided, including a custom tool that they built and really installed with Lilly several years back that helped
Okay, we seem to have lost a little bit of audio there with Mike and Scott, so we're going to try and pick that up just while we're working through that little issue, though. Certainly, thank you, Mike, and thank you, Scott, for presenting there. Just before I hand over to Shankar, I want to encourage you to keep on submitting questions there in the chat. We've had some great questions come in so far, and we're going to get to those very quickly in the Q&A. And we'll try and get to as many of those as we can. But now, though, let me just pass the mic over to Shankar. Shankar is a senior solutions consultant here at Inova. He's been working closely with the team at Eli Lilly for some years now. And Shankar, you're going to talk us through some of that work that you've been doing with them right now. Shankar?
Yes, thanks, Dylan, and hello, everyone. And thank you, Mike and Scott, for that insightful presentation. I'm I'm sure we have lots of questions lined up, so I won't take up too much time. I'd like to briefly talk about our partnership with Eli Lilly, which highlights our commitment to our customers and the life sciences industry as a whole. As many of you know and use, Inova is a partnering platform to efficiently manage your external innovation and BD lifecycle. So from screening and triaging interesting opportunities to managing deal transactions, and many of you go as far as utilizing our tools for post-deal alliance management as well. Of course, one of the most critical stages of deal flow is due diligence, and you just heard from Mike and Scott on how Lilly has developed processes and tools to maximize the efficiency of their diligence teams. Inova plays an integral part in that process. So we wanted you to take you through that quickly and show how Inova and Lilly relationship has flourished over the years to make that happen. In 2015, Lilly deployed the Inova solution to its external innovation and BD teams. We have, excuse me, we have one of the largest user base at Lilly. In 2016, we started a conversation with Mike and team to transform their legacy DD system. The goal was to translate the features and functionality into modern and intuitive companion app that work alongside the Inova platform. And within less than a year, in 2017, we were able to develop and deploy the due diligence module as an extension to the existing Inova application. Now, 3+ years after its deployment, Lilly has been able to use the diligence module to validate over $15 billion in deals and counting. So not bad. So what did we build? Mike spoke about 3 pillars earlier. We translated those key concepts, people, process, knowledge base, into enabling technology tools that optimized how diligence projects were conducted. An application that allowed creation of diligence projects, sharing relevant documents and emails, identifying functional areas, and using themes as Scott showed earlier to ultimately conduct assessments and generate full diligence reports with a click of a button. Having such technology-enabled processes allows teams to ensure that operational inefficiencies, lack of information, or ineffective communication is not hindering progress on a major deal. So again, it can be very helpful to have tools like ours, of course. And as evident by the deal numbers we showed you in the last slide, the module has been quite successful at Lilly. Okay, so that's all the time I want to take up today. I'll, of course, be happy to have follow-up conversations with anyone interested in seeing more. But without further ado, I'm going to pass it back to Dylan and start our Q&A.
Thanks, Shankar. Let's start off the Q&A, and you can keep submitting questions in the chat there, and I'll try and get to them if we have time to move through. So Mike, I'll get you to throw on your webcam as well, Shankar too. But this first question came up for you, Scott, when you were talking. We have a question from Janet who was asking, what is meant by a synthetic story?
And so bringing all the disparate pieces of, functional area scientific perspectives together and synthesizing those. And so we can have a full report, as Shankar was just pointing out, that's 250 pages long. That's way too much for our sponsors to digest in a short time. And so what we do is put together 3 to 5 page synthesis of exactly that information, integrating all of that information in from the reports. That was what I meant by a synthetic story, right? And so bringing all the disparate pieces together and narrating a story from that.
Okay, thanks, Scott. Scott, there's another question there for you as well from Clinton. He asks, you mentioned documenting the perspectives from different teams and from your experts. But how are you centralizing all of these perspectives? And is that where the tools that Shankar was talking about, is that where they come in?
Yes, very much so. And Shankar didn't show the overall ratings tab that he has in that tool, but I talked about a data integration meeting that we have with our teams. Before that meeting, I have a panel in the Inova DD module that you have designed for us that allows me to see at a glance where all of my significant high-risk gaps are, and address those in my data integration with the team. And so not only am I kind of getting each functional area's perspective in their attendant reports, but I also have a nice radar screen that shows me where my problem spots are and where I really need to focus my attention in the conversation with the team.
Mike, I might direct this next one to you. It's from Douglas. Douglas asks, how often do you revisit your due diligence process for effectiveness?
Oh, great question, Douglas. I appreciate that. In fact, my due diligence team leaders know they don't get full credit for a due diligence project until we've conducted a no stripes after action review. So when the project is closed out, we sit down and talk about what was new, what was different, what would we do different in terms of an experiment the next time. So we're constantly augmenting our approach and tool set. Certainly in this environment with COVID and running virtual, we had plenty of practice, in fact, running virtual projects. Additionally, within 6 to 9 months of closing a deal, we reach back and talk to the team who has their hands on the project and assess with them what questions did we miss, what surprises did you have. Good surprises, surprisingly, are sometimes as bad surprises. If we underestimated upside and we didn't budget for it, that becomes a challenge for the organization and creates some noise. So we're constantly reaching back to teams that have done deals that have done. We also track those things where we in fact disengage to see if in fact these are picked up or eventually partnered. I'll tell you, in more than one instance, we've disengaged, and based on the feedback we gave the partner, they've come back to us. And in fact, that's how we proceeded with our acquisition of Leucemia. It was multiple diligences. So I think how you provide feedback is ultimately perhaps someday self-serving for you too.
Maybe Micah, if I can continue with you here, we have another question from Yuan to ask, at what point is it appropriate for a potential in-licensing target to ask for feedback?
Yeah, I think when we stage our diligence, sometimes it's a little more dramatic, the stages and the timing between stages than others. I think in our case, in some ways, providing feedback to the partner after we've networked our findings is, in fact, outing any potential organizational bias. If the partner disagrees with our position, it may be a good faith discussion that translates into some observation that we maybe caught something a little bit wrong, or maybe they have more data that they didn't share with us that all of a sudden comes to the forefront. So I think after, however your diligence goes, or if you decide to disengage, I think it's appropriate to reach back and provide the partner that kind of feedback. Many of our peer companies do that, certainly, but in talking to many biotech partners, they don't always get that.
We have another question here from Michael, and I might shift back to you, Scott, again. And the question, or there's a couple of different questions actually on the same theme, which is, how has your due diligence changed, if at all, now that everybody's gone into lockdown? Has that affected the way that you're executing these due diligence processes?
Absolutely, it has, but maybe not as much as one would think or one would imagine. So at least in my projects, as I facilitate, I like to have everybody sitting around a table so that I can read the room and understand the nonverbal language that's going on, and really get a sense for if people are uncomfortable with the recommendation that we're making or the perspectives that we're drawing. I can't do that in this environment. So I feel a little hampered by that, but instead what I've just done is gone around and pulled everybody on the phone to get their frank perspective, and so kind of put them on the spot which is something that in person I typically don't do. But it has changed that kind of psychology of how do you get to the real issues that people maybe aren't articulating. In person, you can call out the person who's not speaking, right? It's a little harder to do that over the phone, but I think our volume of due diligence hasn't decreased at all. In fact, it might have gone up some, and we've been, I think, managing fairly well. Mike might correct me if he thinks differently, but I think we've kind of caught a flow that we can live with.
Okay, and maybe this will be just a follow-up to that, and either for yourself, Scott, or for you, Mike. You talked a lot about the clinical assessments and the assessment of the clinical data that you have to do, but some of these partnerships are going, and some of this due diligence is going to be on physical, on-site manufacturing facilities as well. How is that being managed in a time where it's very difficult to be in place physically?
Yeah, really important
Mike, you want to
question.
address
Maybe
that?
I'll take that. Yeah, hopefully you guys can hear me. I think audits are a real part of our day visits anyway. Ultimately, organization like Lilly is highly leveraged through other strategic partners, CROs and CMOs. And as a sponsor working with the FDA or global regulatory agencies, you have an obligation to maintain oversight. So even for our own portfolio, we are finding it challenging. Now, in those areas where we have colleagues working in Asia or Europe, we have people on the ground. They're getting stretched because they're normally supported with colleagues based here in the US or elsewhere. So that is creating some issues. But I think CMOs and CROs are getting used to the fact that they need to try and get some of this work done virtually. And so they've opened up e-rooms, they've made their SOPs and batch records and those kind of details available. I know of at least one case where people are using drones to support a virtual tour of their facilities inside and out, which is interesting. Or just FaceTime kind of video as a walk around and live chat. It's like, hey, what's over in that corner? What do you have stored behind that door, et cetera. So I think people are working it out. It may, in fact, provide some opportunities in the future when we get out of this pandemic situation, because it does result in a lot of people traveling all over the world, that's for sure, to maintain these complex portfolios of relationships.
Okay, Scott, maybe back to you. There's a question from Yuan to ask, how long does a typical due diligence process take from beginning to end? Can we put that in terms of time?
Yeah, but I don't know whether there's a typical. And so we run our diligence in stages, and stage one due diligence usually has a fairly, typical rhythm, and 3 to 4 weeks from maybe sending a nomination request, so putting our team together and reading out to a sponsor. It can happen faster than that. It can certainly happen slower than that if a partner's not being as transparent or disclosing as much as needs to be. But we usually have a conversation with the partner at the outset before we even send the nomination request within our organization to get alignment on that timing and to make sure that we have that locked down. And then when we do issue a nomination request, that timing is baked in. So the functional areas that nominate their team members are all doing that with this window in mind. So those folks are available and they're going to be dedicated, at least most of the time, to the due diligence project. And so, it's easier to predict the stage one 3 to 4 weeks usually. But that's not typically when we're signing an agreement. It's coming after stage two and some additional diligence, and that can take quite a while. I have, several that have gone more than a year. You hope that those aren't, the regular ones, but, it's all going to kind of depend on transactions, how you negotiate your way through this, and we're playing this game in synchrony with our business development and search and evaluate colleagues. And so there's bigger pieces than just the diligence that are going into that stage 2 piece.
Mike, a question from Janet. Janet's asking, how do you learn from due diligence concerns that were later found out to be critical? How do you learn from those?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think sometimes we flag a concern, and when we actually have engaged, it turns out even the partner's knowledge that there was a concern was in some ways not totally accurate. In fact, the concern can be much higher. So I think in some ways it's how we get teams to think about how big of a deal this could be. Ultimately understanding there's an error bar on our interpretation sometimes of the facts. The consequences of moving to COVID, a kind of pandemic situation that nobody anticipated how that was going to affect things like the conduct of clinical trials. And I think some companies have navigated that perhaps depending on where they are in geography and conducting that work in different ways. And so I think there's a predictable element. Nothing's ever bulletproof, but it's kind of what are you prepared to do to, in fact, augment your resources to address those issues that become a little more surprising, perhaps, than were anticipated out the gate.
And Scott, I've probably got what is our last question there for you, which is quite simply that they're asking, not every company's the same size as Eli Lilly, nor has Eli Lilly's resources. Are the best practices that you've mentioned able to be used by smaller companies, or should they adapt to size?
Yeah, I don't think that there's any reason why this can't be scaled down to the level of the company that you are. And so if you have, say, 4 scientific experts or 3 scientific
And it seems to me that we've lost Mike and Scott again there.
Me?
I think we just lost you
there,
Scott, for a moment. Yeah, we did unfortunately.
Yeah,
you were saying?
Yeah, I went off video because it seems like we're having. Yeah, I'm here.
I think we're right up on time, all the same. So I'm going to run through just a couple of the last things here. Certainly, I want to just take an opportunity to thank our guests, Mike and Scott of Eli Lilly, and Shankar as well from here at Inova. And of course, thank you all for attending this afternoon too. A couple of final notes. First, coming up in September is the first in a series of virtual partnering events jointly presented by Inova and Bio and focused on specific therapeutic areas. The first of these events is focused on oncology, and we're expecting to facilitate something in the order of 5,000 partnering meetings over the course of 3 days. There's more information and a link to register at virtualpartnering.com/oncology. That's virtual-partnering.com/oncology. You can keep your eye on your email inbox tomorrow. You'll receive a link to review the video of the webinar. And of course, you should feel free to share that link with your colleagues who might be interested but were unable to join us on the call today. And finally, don't forget to complete the survey that pops up when you exit the call. Your feedback is really valuable. And if you'd like to participate as a panelist on a future webinar, you can let us know that in the survey as well. And with that, we're done. Thank you all. Please stay safe and well. And thanks again for joining Inova this afternoon.